Mr. President, my dear colleagues, in the steps of the Argonauts, this class of 2014 shares its birth date with the centennial of a world-altering event of which I hope its members here are historically aware. If not, then perhaps we should postpone this ceremony and send them back to class. There's yet another centennial, ignorance of which, unless they are students of colonial history, may be excused. But we shall come to that junior event in a moment. As your speaker today happens to be a link to that second history across time and distance, it is quite appropriate that we share the commemoration of all three events. After all, we are both products of a colonial formation. The first event is none other than World War I, which was predicted optimistically would be the very last of its kind. Has there been human progress since then? We're looking here at repetition as in history repeats itself, perhaps. Well, let's take a simple signpost, but a critical one. Once humanity did believe that the earth was flat, like a coin, and that any ship which ventured too close to the edge would simply plunge into a bottomless void. A roll call of scientists paid the supreme price for contesting that superstition. Many were broken on the wheel by the Roman Catholic Inquisition for placing empirical deductions over divine dogmatism. Some recanted, others did not. We're all beneficiaries of the victory of inquiry over dogma and thus inculpated in the defense of that one axis of history. The heritage belongs to humanity for keeps, but securely? I suppose it all depends on which part of the globe is in question. The relevant consequence of the routing of the Flat Earth Society and allied theologies for me is that it enables me to be a part, in a very specialized way, of the commemoration of this very year, 2014, for it marks the centennial of the other event of 1914. This was the year in which a tiny island known as England, having sailed across the forbidden edge of the flat earth, set its stamp on a huge slab of real estate, amalgamated its parts, and named it Nigeria. It marked, for us in Nigeria, the consolidation of an act of piecemeal robbery, which, following the notorious Berlin Conference, saw a vast continent divided among complete strangers. Their explorers had paved the way, the missionaries had made it their mandate, the seizure of millions of souls for a divine empire called Christendom. 1914 was therefore a remarkable conjugation of the interests between God and Mammon, the acquisition of souls on the one hand, and then access to vast resources, raw material especially, for Europe's development generally, and as critical assets, both human and raw, for the First World War. The interests of pre-existent entities with their own histories, their own ways of managing existence, of relating to phenomena, all came under alien laws, under alien strategies of survival, alien modes of self-regulation, etc., etc. They were made, the people, to enter into covenant with alien deities, occasionally through persuasion, mostly through violence and war. Today, a full century later, history appears to be on a grand reversal, riding on the wings of the Flat Earth Society in different form, because they are more commonly known as Boko Haram, translated as Western education is a sin, which is a most inadequate rendition. Knowledge is anathema, comes much closer to its comprehensive agenda. This is why even the intellectual repositories of Islam in Muslim nations, such as Mali, with her ancient libraries of Timbuktu, and Islamic scholars in surrounding states, including mine, Nigeria, are daily targets of fundamentalist insanity. The achievements of generations since 1914 and before are menaced again by the desperation of a rival theology, inflicting on that long-suffering continent a real question of survival and the precariousness of centuries of monuments. We're speaking here of disparate entities which, finding themselves corralled into an enforced cohabitation, have continued to make the best of that dubious shotgun polygamous marriage through a vision of oneness. I do not need to be told that at least partially usurping what should be an uncluttered space, celebratory space in the minds of many of us gathered here, is the fate of some 300 vulnerable beings deprived of the expectations that unite us on these grounds and demonstrably across the globe. Let me induct you through the parallelisms between 1914 and a people's sociology a century later. The regard and designation which the rudimentary media in my part of the world, as well as in learned circles, accorded the average colonial citizen with educational ambitions was that of 20th century Argonauts. The pinnacle of fulfillment was then to physically set off for the European world, the United Kingdom especially. If that failed, then the United States, in search of an academic degree in the sciences or arts, in the legal or medical professions, engineering, etc. The UK was favorite, while the United States came second. The United States was, after all, just another ex-colony and thus an offshoot of Europe. So why not go directly to source? For such lucky voyagers, during the grandiose send-off ceremonies, the kinsfolk would hail our beloved son or daughter departing these shores in search of the golden fleece. If you read some of the biographies of our first-generation bigwigs, you're bound to encounter an early reference to their epic search for the coveted fleece. The 15, 20, sometimes 30-day journey to Europe was fraught with dangers of being torpedoed by German U-boats, strafed by enemy bombers, and even taken prisoner. Indeed, German U-boats claimed their first victims in 1914. And so Thanksgiving services and parties thrown by the stay-at-homes, on learning that their sons and daughters had arrived safely on the distant shores, were nearly as sumptuous as the send-off ceremonies themselves. As the war intensified, that metaphor, Argonaut, became even more richly deserved. Well then, what happened to those who were not of moneyed aristocracy, but whose thirst for knowledge, or at least qualification, was not to be denied? Very simple. They enrolled in British correspondence schools, and only few of the generations that followed mine would have heard of the magical name of Wolseley Hall, Oxford. But that was the aristocracy of correspondence schools in those days. Wolseley Hall was simply knowledge. Apart from obvious examples such as medicine, the practical side of engineering, chemistry, etc., there was hardly any subject in which the ambitious West African could not obtain a degree simply by saving up a few pounds of his salary every month and dutifully following courses by correspondence. He posted his homework, they were marked with comments and returned, and so on. At the end of 3 or 4 years, the postal Argonaut journeyed to the center of the nation for examinations under the supervision of one of those agencies like the British Council, recognized institutions, or the colonial district officer. His answer papers were sent up, and eventually both his certificate and his bachelor's hood were posted to him for the iconic photograph. It was not quite as glamorous as actually going up to distant shores in search of knowledge, but the fleece was delivered anyway. And sometimes the acquisition of that first degree resulted in his obtaining a scholarship for a higher one or a related diploma. In some cases, his relations rallied round, taxed themselves, sold or donated a piece of communal land, and so sent him off through the ocean. So he did undergo all the hazards, especially as World War II emerged. Go forth into the wide world. That was the injunction. Learn the secrets of other lands, then come back home to advance your own race and community. Now, try and transpose those early beginnings to this year, 2014. Picture both those who sailed and the land-circumscribed Argonauts in the supposedly peaceful era of 2014. The land voyagers braved the length and breadth of a nation, yet in the throes of rudimentary public transportation, 4 to 6 days travel for today's 2-hour flight at most. Today, they must brave different dangers. The danger, the menace of a resurgence of medieval clericalism, the defenders of the flat earth mentality. To these, knowledge, unless it stems from their own narrow and rigid and often distorted texts, is an impiety that is punishable by death. They consider all music the diabolical warble of sirens seducing humanity from the strict path of righteousness. Numerous predecessors have fallen to the clashing rocks, the equivalent, that is, a rain of stones on a woman while buried up to their necks. Others are the companions of Odysseus, prey to the cannibalistic craving of the tribe of Polyphemus, who pick them off one by one. But the survivors arrive, drained but determined. Their woolsey trials are set before them, and they commence their final test for admission to that desperately craved companionship of the learned. Then comes the ultimate horror. The latest weapons of instant destruction are unleashed against them, now that they are obligingly corralled in search of education for the final rites of passage, the intellectual. Survivors are dragged into the deep jungle fastnesses as slaves to be tortured, violated, or slaughtered for the pleasure of one-eyed Polyphemus and his Cyclops. This is the plight of the modern-day Argonauts. This is the horror that currently resounds around the world. It is one, however, that stiffens the sinews of survivors. Despite all peril, they continue the quest for the golden fleece. It is the eternal quest of humanity since the beginning of time, a thirst that commences and recommences. No sooner one barrier against knowledge and enlightenment is crossed. It is not a call to arms or a plea for solidarity that emerges from the stricken at such dire times, but a recollection that their odyssey is shared to inspire and animate all who are sworn to celebrate both achievements and aspiration. For each and every celebrant here, it is the closing of one individual history or way station and the opening into another. Our very presence here, collectively, is a gesture of contempt for the obsessed Cyclops wherever found and however empowered by the forces of darkness in obsessed assaults on the agencies of enlightenment. These were the very sentiments I offered as consolation only a month ago at an event which, with a seeming uncanny prescience, opened virtually on the day of the murder of nearly 100 workers at a motor park and the abduction of nearly 300 young Argonauts, mostly female. This event took place, it was the book fair in Nigeria's Port Harcourt, designated the World Book Capital for, yet again, this year, 2014. Then, the Flat Earth Society, operating under a blasphemous rendition of Godhead, desecrated the humanity of his creations. And yet, here I am, urging you a message of celebration from across the Atlantic. This seeming contradiction stems from a simple conviction. We are incorrigible, all of us, incorrigible promulgators of the humanized vision of society, despite its many afflictions and betrayals. To bring such a vision to its full expression is the unparalleled gift that belongs uniquely to men and women of intellect and imagination. Among such species, and here I speak as a teacher, we're fulfilled when we encounter from time to time unique acolytes of this vision, those whose promise already affirms commitment to the vision. We are indeed fortunate when our paths cross those of such an exceptional kind, where we're enabled to glimpse a definition of our own inner quest through the revelation of their sense of mission. We do not necessarily manifest ourselves in the same language of fulfillment. Nevertheless, we recognize that these are the future teachers and builders of our time, the expansionists, in turn, of the provenance of the mind. As physicists, musicians, engineers, statesmen, philosophers, griots, designers, editors, architects, or whatever, we are encouraged to believe that they will go on to become the great expositors of the loftiest humanistic ideals. Such lives will then be dedicated to revealing or establishing that context from within which we ourselves learn anew how to view our world as imbued with infinite possibilities, as endowed with unmined resources, encouraging us to reach further, to explore deeper, and thus embellish and transcend even the attainments of present existence. These rites of passage reinforce the nurturing grounds for such minds and visionaries among you. All those who have participated in the qualifying rites have already carved their potential on the milestones of that collective odyssey. Thus, again and again, even from our traumatized spaces, the message that comes to you is simply that we're all unflinching partners in resistance to any force of deprivation of the infinite plenitude of enlightenment. This has been manifested robustly from one corner of the globe to another in these past few weeks. So what is there left to say, except let us celebrate? Thank you.